Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Cassie Riva. I'm the events coordinator at an Unlikely Story bookstore in Plainville, Massachusetts. Here's a couple technical tips for you. Any questions you have for the authors can be written in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, or in the chat, or in the Facebook comment section. If you'd like to buy the book, click the green button at the bottom of your screen and it'll take you to our website. And when you purchase Florence Adler Swims Forever from an Unlikely Story, you're going to receive an autographed book plate from the author while supplies last. I am delighted to introduce best-selling author Rachel Beanland. Rachel's debut novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever, came out in July of 2020 and quickly became a New York Times Book Review's Editor's Choice and one of USA Today's best books of 2020. Rachel also writes essays which have appeared in Lit Hub, Business Insider, Creative Nonfiction, and Broad Street, among other places. She is a graduate of the University of South Carolina and earned her MFA in creative writing from Virginia Commonwealth University. Rachel currently lives in Richmond, Virginia with her family, and Florence Adler Swims Forever is now available in paperback. Interviewing Rachel tonight is the award-winning author of These Ghosts Are Family, Maisy Card. These Ghosts Are Family was a fiction category winner for the 2021 OCM Bocuse Prize for Caribbean Literature and was a finalist for several other awards, including the PEN Hemingway Award for Debut Novel and the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. Maisy's writing has appeared in the Paris Review Daily, Lit Hub, the New York Times, among other publications. Maisy was born in St. Catherine, Jamaica, and raised in Queens, New York. She's currently an instructor for the Sackett Streets Writers Workshop and a fiction editor for the Brooklyn Rail. I cannot recommend both Rachel and Maisy's books more, and I am so excited to hear them speak tonight. So without further ado, Rachel, Maisy, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So great to talk to you, Rachel. As I was saying before, I saw a lot of connections between both of our novels. And I wanted to start by just, I guess, I see somebody ordered the book, mentioned in the chat. So for people who haven't actually read it yet, can you just kind of introduce the book and also talk a little bit about the note that you have at the end of the book about how this was inspired by your family?
Yeah. So the book is about a family, the Adler family. They're a Jewish family living in Atlantic City in 1934. And they are, in the very beginning of the book, I'm not giving anything away to tell you this, Florence Adler, who's a 20-year-old daughter of Joseph and Esther Adler. She's a champion swimmer. She goes out for a swim. She's training to swim the English Channel, and she drowns off the coast of Atlantic City. When this happens, her older sister, Fanny, is in the hospital on bed rest. She's lost a baby the previous summer. And so, it's deemed better for her to be on extended bed rest. And the family makes the kind of split-second decision to keep Florence's death a secret from Fanny, who is in the hospital. And the story is really about what happens to this family over the course of the summer as they are keeping this secret that is, almost sure to unravel at any moment. It really asks questions about kind of whether we have the right to keep secrets like that from the people we love, and why. The story, and many readers don't kind of figure this out until the end, so this is a sneak peek for people in the audience. The story is based on a true story that happened in my family, and a lot of people can't believe it because it seems like such an outlandish principle, right? This idea that this family would kind of come together and keep something as major as a death from someone they loved. But that's exactly what happened in my family 90 years ago. In 1929, my great aunt, Florence Lowenthal, was training to swim the English Channel. She was a champion swimmer, and she went out for a training swim on July 3rd, 1929, and she drowned off States Avenue. And there were lots of witnesses, lifeguards worked to save her. It was very dramatic, like hour or two on the beach. My grandmother was a little girl when that happened. She was 6 years old, and witnessed the whole thing. And that summer, her mother was in the hospital. She had been staying with her grandmother. and was just kind of witness to everything that followed. In the real story, I think they kept the secret for about 3 weeks. And of course, I'm a fiction writer, so I can do whatever I want. I made it much longer. I stretched it over about 2 months. But yeah, that's kind of the gist is that it's based on this family secret that then I kind of took and really blew up.
I was reading an essay that you wrote in LitHub, and I just wanted to read a quote from it. You said, "My mother turned the story into an allegory, Florence and Ruth's mother into a saint. Can you even imagine what it must have taken to keep a secret?" she'd asked when I was growing up, and I would shake my head no. So I was wondering, with this kind of story that's so kind of ever present in your childhood, did you feel like you needed permission from your family to tell the story, or did you just kind of just
move forward?
Yeah, move forward.
It was a story that was very well trodden in my immediate family. So, my grandmother didn't like to talk about it. She was a little girl when it happened. It was one of her most traumatic memories. And so, as I was growing up, I don't remember her telling me the story much. She, of course, at some point had told the story to my mother because my mother knew it. But primarily when I was growing up, I would hear my mother tell the story to me. And I could tell a few things. I mean, my mother was very fascinated by the story. I think most people in the family were. Certainly the women in the family, I think, were very fascinated by it. But what was particularly interesting to me as I got older was the way that the women in my family really put my great-great-grandmother's decision to keep this secret on a pedestal. Like, nobody questioned her decision to do it. Everyone kind of universally believed it was the right call. And I saw the ways that trickled down in our own family, even, 70, 80 years later, like the things that we wouldn't tell my grandparents, who were getting into their 80s and 90s at that point, for fear of like worrying them, or, there were a lot of things we kind of didn't share. Whereas like my generation might have shared it, but my mother's generation said, no, like that stays in this house. And so I don't know that I really questioned so much writing the story in terms of my mother, because I felt like my mother had kind of almost been preparing me to write the story for my whole life. But I did have serious, concerns about telling my grandmother I was writing it. I was very, very scared to tell my grandmother I was writing it. And you know how it is when you're writing a debut novel, like, I mean, it's not even called a debut novel. It's like a Word document on your computer. You don't know that it's ever going to be anything, So periodically my mom would say, like, have you talked to Nani? This is what I called my grandmother. She was probably 92 at this point. Have you talked to Nani about what you're writing? And I'd say, well, no, not yet. Like, not quite yet. And I did start to have some conversations with my grandmother about Atlantic City and about that story and what it was like to grow up there. But I was still really terrified to tell her, like, the truth, that I was writing about this very specific story in her childhood. And finally, when I was about halfway done writing the book, my grandmother was getting sick, and, it looked like she wasn't going to be around for very long. And my mother insisted. My mother was down visiting her, and she said, Rachel, I'm going to tell her. And so that kind of took it off my plate, which I feel bad about now. But she did sit down and say, look, this is what's happening. I mean, it hadn't sold. There was nothing really to tell. But my grandmother was really funny because she was just very humble and stoic, and just like, I don't know, she was a great person. And her only question was like, well, why would anyone find that interesting? Or, and that was kind of the thing with my mom too, was like, when I would tell her I was working on it, I was in a novel writing workshop, and I mentioned this in the essay, like, I would say, I'm working on this thing, and I'm getting really great feedback from everybody. And my mom's like, that's nice, and I'd be like, well, they really like how there's all this moral ambiguity. And she was just like, I don't understand. Like, what moral ambiguity? Like, how are you telling me there are two sides to this story? And, I felt like there were.
Yeah, that was one of the things I liked, especially loved about this book was the moral ambiguity. It just felt like you were leaving it up to the reader to kind of judge these characters.
Yeah.
And kind of decide what was right based on their own experience in the end. But yeah, I guess I was wondering how difficult that was for you to kind of maintain that balance. I found that even the characters who I didn't like, like Isaac, I kind of empathized with and kind of understood in a way. And I think that's very difficult to do in a novel, to make the reader be able to connect with somebody, even if they're going to do a very bad thing.
Yeah.
So how did you kind of maintain that?
I don't know how you feel about some of your characters, but like for me, I almost loved Isaac the best. Like, I put the most work into him or something. Like, I really wanted him, and anyone who's listening to this and already has read the book is going to be like, I hate him. What are you talking about? But like, I really wanted to kind of nurture him and like try to really get at like where he was coming from and why he had turned out the way he did. And I gave him more backstory than I gave most of my other characters. Really wanting to kind of explore like why he was making the decisions he was making. So, absolutely, like, certain characters kind of took a lot more work than others. And I, it's interesting. I was writing about a family story, but it was a family story that happened so long ago that it was really like I was writing fiction. I was writing fiction, but like I didn't know these people, like the only person I knew was my grandmother, and I hadn't known her as a little girl. So for me, I really did try to start from scratch and think about, well, what kind of character would make that decision, or what would be the traits of someone who was completely in the dark, or this sort of thing. And I will say that in doing that, in kind of thinking about each of these people I'm related to, but thinking of them as fictional characters and approaching them like with the craft of fiction, like, coming with me, my toolbox, I came to have a lot of appreciation for even the characters that I couldn't understand so much at the outset, like Esther. I think early on in my teens and 20s, I had a really hard time understanding how she could have made that decision. But of course, as I wrote her, I came to understand it more.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, the Abel Paisley character in my novel is a little similar to the Isaac character. And it's almost like I felt like I ended up spending more time with him because he was just harder to understand. But yeah, I think with reading Isaac, it's like, I feel like everybody has an Isaac in their family and you're just like kind of rooting for them.
Yeah, we connect, right? Like,
yeah. And you don't want them to let you down, but you kind of know they will.
Yeah. You have a lot of empathy for them, and if you understand their struggles and the times they've tried the right thing, or whatever the case may be, I think it goes a long way.
Just in terms of like your writing process though, how long did it take you to kind of go from, or how did you go from like family lore to like a full-length novel? And how long was the process?
Yeah, so it sounds like you, from what I know about your background, like it sounds like you and I were on the same page. Like we were working full-time jobs and writing on the side, right? That's what you were doing? I was working for actually the local community arts center down the street from my house, the Visual Arts Center of Richmond. And it was a really intensive job, small nonprofit, lots to do, always more to do than there is time. I have 3 kids, and they, at the time, it was 4 years ago now or something. I don't even want to do the math on their ages, but there are a lot of them, and they're all different ages. And so I was really like kind of running around like a maniac, and I figured out like I turned 35, And I was like, if I'm ever going to do this, like, I have to actually do it. Like, I'd always wanted to write a novel, but it's not going to write itself, you know? And so I started waking up super early. I would wake up at 4:30 in the morning and I would write until 7. And then I would get on with my day and like get the kids out of the house and go to work and all of that. And so I started in earnest. I probably spent about a year just reading and thinking. But I really didn't write down like a single word during that period at all. I mean, like, but I was kind of just noodling over characters. And then I sat down to write in the fall of 2016, just in these little chunks. And I don't know about you, but like I could do the math in the margins of my like notebooks and be like, well, okay, so like 2.5 hours times 7 days in a week and like whatever. I mean, to where I could kind of figure out like I write at this speed, this is going to take me forever, like whatever, you know, like I was pretty driven with it. And so I finished it in 2 years doing it that way.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. How about your story?
Oh, it took me forever, but I didn't have like that kind of like discipline. I just didn't have a plan. Like, I think it took me like in total, probably from start to finish, like 12 years. But, you know, I didn't even know I was like writing a novel in the beginning. And yeah, I was working. But mostly, yeah, it just didn't feel like there was any urgency, like anybody was waiting for it. So I kind of just, you know, would put it away for long periods of time. And I think maybe I went to the MFA program a bit too young for me personally. That's
interesting. How old were you when you went?
24.
Okay, so I was like the oldest person in my MFA because I took this novel writing workshop at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, originally as a community member. Like I just wanted to write this novel. And so I said, do you mind if I come and take this one graduate class? That it was a year-long course, like over 2 semesters. And they were like, yeah, send a writing sample, we'll think about it. And then they let me in. And then it wasn't until the next year that I actually applied to be in the program. Mm-hmm. I started out part-time and then I ended up going full-time after the novel sold. But I was definitely the oldest person there. And I was 36, 37 when I started maybe. So that's interesting, like the two experiences, you know.
Yeah, because I found like, you know, I was just like, professors would give all this amazing wisdom, but it just like I just couldn't absorb it. And then all of a sudden, yeah, it was like around like 33, all of a sudden I was like, I get it now. And I just, you know, the second half of the book went so quickly, but the first half was like such a painful kind of slog.
And I think as you get busier in your life, you also realize like no one is going to magically grant you like the time you need to write it. And so you start compartmentalizing and just like, okay, well, how do I knock this out, you know, as quickly as I can maybe. I overall, I think I liked going back older. I would have preferred to maybe have a few fewer children while I was like there was that balancing act. Yeah. I remember very early in the program, someone turned to me and said, we're going to go catch a movie later. You want to come? And I was like, no, like, what? No, I've got 3 kids waiting for me at home. But we were talking about something else that was like, I got us off track with the graduate program stuff. But so, okay, you were yours over 12 years. I was 2 years.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask though, just because it is a historical novel also, like how much research was involved? Like how big was that process in part of your process?
Oh my God, it was so huge. How about you?
It was huge. And then I hardly put anything in.
Right. Well, that is the trick, right? You do all this research and then it's like, it just kind of flavors it, right? But like you have to hold yourself back and not tell everyone everything you know about Jamaica in the 1960s.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fun that you now know, you know. And yeah, for me, Atlantic City was a super rich place to research. I was not very familiar with it, funny enough, considering that my grandparents grew up there. They went and moved away, you know, after college. And, you know, my mother grew up like visiting her grandparents there. But by the time I was born, there was nobody there to visit. And so, I went to a conference there one time. I just didn't have much reason to go. And when I set out to write this, I really had to teach myself like Atlantic City from scratch. And I used a lot of secondary sources to start with. But what I found to be super helpful in Atlantic City was all the postcards, like for just a visual representation of the city. I don't know that there's any place on earth that has had more postcards created than Atlantic City. Every hotel and pier handed those out. So that was really useful. I always use a lot of maps. Do you use maps?
I did. I think with my book, I just was like so paranoid about somebody being like, this is not authentic, that I would like study like older maps just to try to like understand like the street that this character would have driven down. But then, that didn't even make it in. So I used a map from a couple years before my book was set. And I blew it up on foam core and would use little pins to like place scenes and stuff. And that was, and also just like Jewish businesses and, where the hotels were and all that, because I felt the same way with Atlantic City in particular, because so many people visited it on vacations. Like there are a lot of Americans, older Americans, who have some connection to Atlantic City. Like it's been shocking as I've done these, events, like how many people honeymooned in Atlantic City or used to visit their grandparents there or whatever. Like everyone's got a connection. And so I was really terrified about someone telling me, that street wasn't named that in that year, whatever, like all those little details. That hotel wasn't constructed until 5 years later or whatever. I think one of the hard things too with the novel for me, or the historical aspect, was just that my family is not very good at preserving photographs or like letters or any kind of ephemera. And so, it made it that much harder. And I did look at postcards. I did try to find other people's, family photos on like Flickr, just to get inspiration. But I saw like an interview with you where you had like it looked like you had a lot of historical photos behind you. So did you use a lot of your family's actual kind of photos or records for inspiration?
Okay. So Simon & Schuster sent me this really giant cover of my book, which is super huge. So I'm going to move it for a second. If it's that stuff you saw, those are actually printouts for my next book for the most part.
I saw something where it looked like you had like black and white family photos.
Oh, maybe. I have a few photographs of my grandmother, Gussie, Gussie was based on my grandmother. Her name was Frances. But so I've got some from her generation and like her mother, who would have been Fanny in the book. What's interesting is I went looking for photos of Florence, because I thought, well, surely we have some, right?
Yeah.
Or, somebody, maybe not my branch, but one branch, would have inherited those. And I couldn't find any. My grandparents had died and my mother and her siblings were going through their house. And I said, Mom, when you get to the photographs, like, will you look for Florence specifically? And there weren't any. And then I asked my great grandmother, who is like, my great aunt, who is my grandmother's sister. I asked her, she's still alive. And I said, where are these photos like of Florence? And she said that actually her mother destroyed them all.
Oh, wow.
So like that it was so painful after she died, that she got rid of them. And I find that to be really like interesting. I did like this whole deep dive and actually wrote this really long essay that I've never published that is exploring that idea of like destroying these photos and what that would have meant. But I mean, this is the same woman who never spoke her name after she died, just never. It's like, I think when you have that kind of trauma, there's this whole school of thought, and certainly there was that school of thought in the 20s and 30s that like the best way to heal is to just never mention it again. And that's definitely what happened in the case of Florence's drowning, which is interesting.
Well, yeah. One of the questions that I would often get asked, I think, about my book was just whether the process of writing, and even though my book is not based on a particular family story, it's just kind of inspired by it, but what if it was kind of cathartic? You know, and I think in the beginning it kind of felt that way, but then, you know, your family just goes back to being your family. And I felt like that feeling goes away. But one thing I did find very cathartic after was when it was published, because I kept my book about secret keeping secret the whole time and didn't say anything till it was actually published. And I just showed my family the finished book. But since, you know, once the book was out there, I felt like it did open the door to all these conversations and, you know, me freely asking, you know, questions about family, whereas before it was done like in a very covert kind of way. But yeah, how has it kind of been for you now that it's kind of out there? How is your family reacting? How do you feel?
My family's been really excited about the book. Like, you know, that it's out there, that it has been well received, that it's something that they, you know, I think they like the fact that this legacy of Florence's, the real Florence Lowenthal, that's being continued, right? For another generation, at least. Like, some people will know who she was. That's kind of exciting. It's actually brought our family together in weird ways where, you know, all of these descendants of, in real life, Florence Lowenthal had like 5 siblings. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is many generations ago now. So those branches are all dissipated and we don't really stay in touch. And except that when people were reading this book, they were like, wait, like I'm related to these people. So we've actually had some really nice Zoom calls with like extended cousins and extended, you know, people who all had their own family stories, you know, that kind of intersected in interesting ways with this one. You know, one thing I think that's really interesting about writing a family story is, you know, it's like this idea that there's no one truth and we all have different, you know, versions of what happened in any circumstance. But I think the same goes for like which stories we pass along, because I had a great conversation with my uncle and my cousin, specifically so I have this cousin, male cousin, who actually runs a bookstore in Maine, but he is also a writer. And we were in Atlantic City scattering my grandparents' ashes. And so we'd all gotten together, 35 of us or something, and he was asking me what I was writing. And I was working on this book at the time. It hadn't sold. And I said, you know, oh, well, I'm working on a fictional account of, you know, that really famous story in our family, Florence's death. And he was like, what? like what story? Like that you've heard 1,000 times, but I've never heard. And we had such a good chuckle about it because he's a guy and he's the son of a guy in the family. You know, he's my mother's brother. And my mother's brother heard the story, you know, when he was growing up, but never bothered to tell the next generation in his family. It didn't really like strike him as something to retell, or, you know, he forgot about it or whatever. Like, whereas for whatever reason, my mother, you know, became fascinated enough by it that she retold it many times. And I think that that's an interesting component of how these stories ever end up on paper, or how, you know, which ones we decide to tell, even within the same family. It can look so radically different.
Yeah, and I love what you said, you know, in the author's note at the end, that this is kind of a tribute to Florence. I mean, that she was the only name that you didn't change.
Yeah. I really couldn't imagine changing her name. My daughter is also named Florence, so I've kind of like kept it in the family. But yeah, I wanted to do that, and I felt like I was okay doing it because, I mean, I was fictionalizing things, you know, in her life, of course, but maybe because she didn't have descendants, I felt a little more permission to do it. Then, you know, I felt like with the other characters, I had to be very clear that like no, these are 100% fictional characters, and that's the way that is. And I thought I could keep the name with Florence and get away with it.
Mm. I think too, one thing that was really great was, this novel is very much about grief, but at the same time, you balance a lot of different emotions. There's humor, it's like a love story. It felt, there was just a nice balance all throughout where you could appreciate the family's grief, but also kind of think more expansively and focus in on these other stories. And I love the rotating. I'm a fan of that.
Yeah, I can tell.
Rotating perspectives. I love that.
I love it too. And I always get, I think it must be something about, we writers, it's like we like being in other people's heads to begin with. This is why we're writing fiction. Yeah. And so when you give me a book with rotating perspectives, I'm like, oh, great. I get to be in lots of people's heads. And I always felt like I felt like this book called for rotating perspectives, particularly because of the fact that it was a book about grief. One of the things I often talk about is the fact that I lost my father pretty young. He was in his 50s and I was in my 20s, and he died of pancreatic cancer. Yes. And we had a big family. I'm one of 4 kids. And so when we came together, like in the last months, when he was dying and in the weeks that followed, I was really paying attention to like the ways we were all dealing with this, and I think in my naivety, my mid-20s, if you had asked me like, well, how are we going to cope with something of this magnitude, like when it comes our way, I would have said like, oh, well, we're all going to rally together and we're going to be on exactly the same page. And we're going to, we're just going to use each other as this like constant source of support. And of course, what I like came to realize going through that loss was that rarely are 2 people on the same page with anything, even when they can all agree that they love their father and are sad that he's gone, right? And so, I always talk about like this idea that like I thought I would reach out to my sisters a lot for support, but it's like, if I'm sad at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, like I'm not going to call my sister while she's at work and like having an okay day, or, like you're trying to be conscious of the fact that everyone is going about their day slightly differently. And I think that for doing something like writing about grief, which would be a very heavy subject if I were writing about it exclusively, like if I were either writing from the perspective of someone that just like could not get out of bed and was just, completely devastated every moment of every day, that would be really tough. And also like I felt like the book called for moments of levity, or you just can't be sad 24 hours a day, right? Like it's just not the way we're wired. And so I felt like since I was going to be talking about such a hard topic, it was nice to be able to change perspectives so that I could get some people on a light day, like just a day when they're maybe doing a little bit better, or they're finding some sort of humor in the world, or they're not as closely connected to Florence in the first place. And so they're just not grieving her in the same way.
Yeah, I think having a child's perspective too, is kind of helpful for, I guess, undercutting just kind of that sense of grief, because children are, feeling such a wide range of emotions or not fully understanding. And I thought the Gussie character was
that came like straight. Some of her stuff came straight out of me raising my own kids, where, I had kids the year after my dad died. So all my kids were adopted. And so one of my daughters, Clementine, came home from Ethiopia literally 2 weeks before my father died. Oh. And she was almost 2. She was walking and talking and like getting into stuff. And, so I had to kind of like compartmentalize and be like, okay, today I am chasing after a toddler, even though like there's a lot going on. And the kids were like, on one hand, they're great because they're this amazing distraction when you're going through something awful. And then on the other hand, they are like a dagger to the heart sometimes, because they will say these things to you that are so mean. Like, you're like, oh, I bet you're really sad granddad can't do that, or, you know, whatever. And you're like, could you just not right now, or what, you know? And so there were times when I was writing Gussie and I was like, yep, this is, you know, my daughter was 8, I think, when I started writing the novel. And so Gussie came very like naturally out of that.
I was also curious, you know, kind of what writers you were reading while you were writing this, or who kind of inspired you.
So I've got like, I have problems. So I read a lot, and I probably would be better suited to try to stick to the genre in which I am writing while I'm reading. I don't know if you have this problem, but I will go and read something like super contemporary while I'm trying to write. Like right now, I'm trying to write a novel set in 1811, and then I go read like The Other Black Girl, and
I do that too. And
then I'm like, oh, should I be writing like a contemporary office, like whatever? And it's like, no, Rachel, like go back to what you're doing in 1811.
Yeah, I think most of when I was writing most of the book, when I was writing it after the MFA, I was like working with kids. I was either teaching, or then I was a school librarian. Then I was like a teen librarian. So I was just reading like a lot of YA fiction. The whole time.
Like that's where I obviously need to be, and like I have this other story to tell. I can tell something different. So, but I am finding like right now I'm trying to read a lot of kind of like colonial / Jeffersonian era type stuff, just to like wrap my head around language and just kind of style and also like what in the world people were doing with themselves back then, right? So that has been helpful. But for Florence Adler, I did read I read a lot of biographies of Trudy Etterly and like things on open water swimming. I really wanted to get all the swimming stuff right. I had done swimming like in, high school, but like, even younger than that, but I was not competitive, let's be frank. And so, I was interested in that. I was reading a lot about like Jewish communities in New Jersey. I was reading a lot about immigration because of course that features in the book as well. And so, yeah, I would say the readings were really, really wide ranging. And then as far as like whether I was reading good fiction set in the 1940s or 30s or, thereabouts, I read some. I'm trying to think now. It's like my mind goes like what I read 4 years ago. Who even knows? I definitely, I remember being really inspired by Anita Diamant's The Boston Girl, or maybe it's just called Boston Girl. I can't remember now. That was one that was definitely, something I was thinking about. There was, what was another book that, Brooklyn was one I thought about a lot. So, certain books kind of came into my life at the right time when I thought like, oh yeah, I'm kind of going for that. But wasn't, I wasn't necessarily always seeking them out.
Great. I think, I don't know. I was such a mess.
What are you reading right now?
What I'm reading right now. What was interesting was that a connection between this novel and the novel I'm writing now is that I wanted to set it in Palm Beach, West Palm Beach. And you have a little mention of that.
Florida.
Yeah. So right now I am reading a lot about historical books about West Palm Beach County, and
Florida in the 20s, I think is like truly fascinating. If you couldn't tell, like I could have put way more Florida in that book. Like,
yeah.
I had to pull myself back from giving you all of my Florida knowledge. But I think that's like such an interesting time in American history. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And it's hard because I felt like with the other book, I spent too much time researching and I don't want to go down that road again. So I'm trying not to get too, order too many books, but I've just like this past week I ordered like 10 books on Amazon about
what I do is like I'll research, like I research enough to just kind of like have my head around it. And then I really think about what scene I'm writing, and I will read like the night before I write. I don't know, do you write in the morning or do you write later?
I'm all over the place right now. I'm figuring out my new.
Well, when I write in the morning, I'll try to read something at night to kind of get me, like, get my juices flowing. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully what I've just read is something that's going to like be informative for the scene. That's my
I do try to do that. Like I'll try to read something. Maybe I don't really write every day. So yeah, sometimes I'll spend like a reading day where I just read different things. And then the next day I'll start writing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, hopefully to find inspiration. But I think we're going to turn to audience questions now.
We have a very quiet audience tonight. If you guys have any questions, you can write them right in the chat.
Maisy and I can just talk all night. So, yeah, the research is like, it's really interesting. I mean, I think like sometimes, I don't know, do you feel like your stories come out of, people talk about like, does your story start with character? Or does it start with setting or situation? I feel like I'm a setting person. Like I want to know the world that I'm interested in all these worlds. Florence is a little bit different because I had this family story. So that was kind of situation more than setting. And then I realized, why would I take it out of this setting that's already really rich and wonderful? But I definitely think a lot about setting.
Yeah, I think because the structure of my novel was kind of like it's a novel in stories. So each section was kind of inspired by, something different. Like I think there are some stories or some chapters that were very character driven or inspired by, like somebody that I had met, or they were a composite of different people. But yeah, there were some that were either, I'm actually really inspired by history, just like reading a newspaper article. But yeah, there were a couple that were inspired by place also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it really, because a lot of people say like, no, I have a character in my head. That's what I think about. And then I figure out where to plunk them down. And for me, like that's really hard to even like wrap my head around when it comes to novels. A story is a little different. You're right.
So the new novel that you're working on, can you say anything about it?
Yeah, I will. So it's in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I live. There was a really horrible theater fire in 1811. It was the night after Christmas. Back then, you used to have people out like on farms and plantations all over Virginia, and they would come into the city for the winter season when the legislature was in session and when it was too cold to plant anything in the ground, basically. And they just live it up and party for 6 weeks. And that's still the way our legislature works, interestingly enough. But so the city was pretty packed, and the theater was really packed, and a prop got caught. There was like a chandelier that was a prop, and of course, because it was 1811, all the candles on it were real, and one of them lit a backdrop on fire, and the next thing you knew, the whole theater was up in smoke. It was really devastating. 72 people died that night, including the governor and like a bunch of muckety mucks. But also primarily women died in the fire. And they tried a lot of different things to explain why so many women died, like in the newspaper accounts and kind of testimonials that came out of it. People would say, well, the women's dresses, were bulky, except they weren't that bulky because it was 1811. So they were kind of wearing those like Jane Austen style dresses. But so there was that. And then they said, well, there were more women in the box seats, and there's not really any evidence to support that, but okay. But really you've got, I think, the situation in which there's, this idea of kind of Southern gentility and chivalry that comes smack up against the reality, which was that men climbed over women to get out of the building. And so, you know, everyone in the city lost someone in that fire. It was, you know, just kind of a devastating event. And it also kicked off the Second Great Awakening because, I mean, it wasn't the only thing that did it, of course, but it was instrumental in kind of bringing religion to not just Richmond, but really the United States. Like, we had been a less religious country, of course, after the Revolution and, you know, after England was sent packing. And there was a lot of belief that, you know, we had kind of brought this on ourselves by, you know, gambling and prostituting our way through the winter months. So that's what I'm exploring in this book. Like, for me, it's got a lot of similarities to Florence because, you know, I am looking at grief again, but I'm kind of using a wider lens to look at it.
So it's also a book that juggles like many different characters.
Yeah, I'm looking at I don't want to get too specific in case I decide some of these characters have got to go, but I'm looking at a kind of combination of free and enslaved, you know, characters, black and white, because what was interesting at that time was, you know, Richmond was about 50% white and 50% free and enslaved blacks, and everyone was affected by the theater fire. So this is early enough days in 1811 that a lot of the kind of laws and statutes that went on the books later, closer to the Civil War, weren't on the books yet. Mm-hmm. And so there was actually an entire gallery in the theater that was full of free and enslaved blacks, and there's some really amazing stories that came out of that. One of the biggest heroes of the night was an African-American blacksmith who saved a bunch of women. And so there are a lot of different perspectives. Part of the problem with basing anything fictional on a true story, you know, and particularly a true story that's this intriguing, is limiting your perspectives and figuring out kind of like who you're going to focus on.
So when you went into the MFA program, did you know that you wanted to be like a historical kind of novelist, or did it just kind of end up that way?
The funny thing is, I still don't think, I mean, like, when I say I want to be a historical, like, I don't know, I just want to write novels. Like, I don't
know how I feel.
You feel the same way? I mean, I do feel like I'm good at the research, and I enjoy it. But I think I would research a contemporary novel just as much, or like pretty darn close. Like, you know, I think I would use those same skills to make sure that I knew what I was talking about with somebody's occupation, or, you know, where they lived, or whatever. You know, honestly, like, a funny part about the novel I'm working on now is I was actually thinking about writing something else that was going to be set like further afield, and I was going to need to do all this travel, and it would have been a contemporary story. But then COVID hit, and I was like, why am I going to write a book where I have to travel a bunch? Like, who knows how long this will last, you know? And so the idea for the writing about the Richmond Theater Fire had been in my head for a decade, but it felt like the right time to write a novel set in my own backyard, because I didn't know when I was leaving my backyard, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the hardest parts was that I decided to write this novel set in West Palm Beach County, a place I've never even been. So I'm like, should I go there?
But if you're setting it in the past?
It's both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you do need to go if you've got a I was going to say, if you're only writing about it like in the 20s or something, like, it's not going to be the same if you go. So, you know.
Yeah, but I do like ask myself the same question because when I wrote These Ghosts Are Family, I didn't even think of it as a historical novel, but I find in conversations I'm having with people, that aspect of it is discussed a lot. And then this next novel, it you know, and the novels I have planned in the future all have that kind of connection too. That they have a lot of research and history. So I'm like, am I? I don't know.
I kind of question like us even just putting a label on historical fiction at all. Like, everything is set in the past. Like, unless you're really writing a novel set in the future. Like, you know, is the 80s the past? Like, you know, is that historical now? Like, I guess it's 50 years. We call anything like 50 years back historical, but that seems really arbitrary. Like, you know, like what the 90s, like I grew up in the 90s. That's feeling historical these days. Like,
that's funny, yeah, because I had this argument with my boyfriend this weekend about classic rock and how music. He was telling me that music from the 90s is now classic rock. I couldn't accept that.
I need to tell my husband that because he knows 90s stations. That's so funny. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's like, it's really just a marketing word. And if it sells books and like it helps, you know, publishers to use it, then fine. But I think where I like struggle a little is when people want to distinguish like historical fiction from literary fiction, or, you know, like, and then
Yeah.
What? Like, no, it can be literary and historical, or, you know, it can be literary and contemporary. It can be both. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I had another question. I feel like at writers' events, a lot of people like hearing, and you talked about a little about experience at an MFA program, but I was curious about how the MFA program kind of helped you finish this novel.
Yeah, that's a great question because it's super helpful. You know, I mean, I can't speak highly enough about MFA programs because I really feel like I'm standing like here, sitting here in front of you because of one. You know, I think one of the big things you get out of an MFA program is great connections. And for me, you know, the connections in the MFA program actually led me to my agent, who then sold my book, you know. So my agent, Chad Lubel, who's with Janko and Nesbitt, actually graduated from my program, you know, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years before me, and was up in New York and, you know, starting to make it. And my professor had been his mentor, you know, my professor in this novel writing workshop I was taking, Tom DeHaven, who's an amazing guy, was, you know, really taken with what I was writing. And in the very, very early days, like, I mean, he had read 2 chapters or something. He was saying, like, I want to introduce you to Chad, you know, I got to make that happen. And I remember he came home from, he'd gone to Chad's wedding and was like, I was at the wedding and I pitched you. I'm like, oh my God, like, let this poor man get married. But it was great. I mean, you know, he came down, one like week to give a presentation to the MFA students, and, you know, everyone could kind of share their query letters with him, and, you know, he was giving people feedback. And my book wasn't done then, but it was getting close, and my query letter was like pretty much ready to go. Like, you know, I wrote a pretty good draft for this, and you know, I gave it to the department, and they like sent him a whole bunch of them, and he, you know, asked me to go to coffee while I was, you know, while he was down visiting. So that kept me going for the last several months of writing the manuscript. Like, I had this very real delivery date, you know, where it was like, hey, I promise I'll get you something. Like, you know, I really wanted to get him something as soon as possible because it felt like that was going to be the beginning of like my new career, you know, like I just needed to finish. And so, you know, and the rest is history. But that was extremely helpful. I mean, obviously, I also became a better writer. I don't want to undersell it. But I just think connections are helpful. And if you can get some faculty that really like take you under their wing and have, you know, published great books themselves, and, you know, it's so helpful. What about you? You said you were younger, so like you didn't have your manuscript in its like final form.
Yeah, I feel like that was, you know, I teach now in for Sackett Street Writers Workshop, and, you know, that's something that a lot of people will ask, you know, whether they should get an MFA and if they should go into an MFA with an idea already. And I think it's so much more valuable if you go in with an idea for, you know, a manuscript and with the intention of finishing a book. And I don't know if I necessarily went in with that intention. I think I just thought things would just fall in place.
Right.
You know, and I didn't have like a strategy, but I think I was also like 24 and I was figuring how to pay rent, and I was just figuring too many other things out, and nothing was kind of stable. So I think I was just a bit distracted. So when I did get an agent, it wasn't till I think it was 2017. So it was like years after. I think I finished the program in 2009 and I got an agent in 2017 and I was still writing the book. And it was because I published an essay, a personal essay just about like my family, and my agent Monica read it and contacted me. And then
I love it when those stories happen.
Yeah.
Like,
and so, yeah, she gave me deadlines, and that ultimately was
they're so key. Whether they're like in your head, and they're just all your own thing. I mean, I have an author right now that I'm friends with where we're just kind of giving each other deadlines and saying like, okay, this is the words we're going to do every month, and check back in. Like we're doing phone calls, and sometimes we email each other our documents and literally don't read them. But it's just whatever it does to like get you motivated. I mean, I think the danger in doing it like I did, where, I officially entered the MFA program with 150 pages of Florence Adler already under my belt, was that I never really gave the short story the attention it deserved. Like I was always the like student who was trying to submit novel chunks to, short fiction workshops. And so there's some benefit in like actually spending your time writing short stories. But it worked out. It was write some short stories.
There is actually one question in the chat, and I know we talked about this. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say that. Yes, Rachel, when is your next book going to be published?
Oh God, I have no idea. I don't want to commit to that. That's like great.
They want more.
Something's coming. I mean, something is coming, but it has to be. I have to finish writing it. So.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Maisy and I are on the same page with this.
Yeah, we are.
Finish writing our books before they.
Thank you both so much. I can't believe it's been an hour. This was like the fastest hour I could listen to you talk all night.
Oh, thank you.
If you already have the hardcover copy, consider picking up the paperback copy. And if you don't want to read it again, you should read it again, because the book is always better, I think, the second time, because you like fully absorb it. But donate it to a library, give it to a friend, pick up a copy of Maisy's book as well. And when you order the paperback copy of Florence Adler Swims Forever, you're going to get a signed book plate from Rachel while supplies last. Thank you both so much. This was so fun.
Thank
Have a great night, everyone. Thank you
so much.
Bye. Have a great night.